Well, it's the middle of summer. I thought I wouldn't talk about that man in the White House or anything like that today. It's hard because you're worried about the Supreme Court, you're worried about choice and abortion rights, you're worried about civil rights. But I heard a man tell a friend of mine the other day how he was self-made and no one ever helped him. Did you hear what I said? He said he's self-made and no one ever helped him. Well, I know his mother, fabulous woman, school teacher, and I know how much she helped him. So I was a little embarrassed for him that he didn't think about that. But I began to think about myself. Are you ready? When I was a kid, our next door neighbor, Mr. McDonald, and Mr. McDonald was always old. He probably was, I thought he was old, but he probably was only 55 first time I met him in the late 50s. Mr. McDonald had built 3 houses, including ours, and Mr. McDonald was an extraordinary man because we were black, and we were the first black people in the neighborhood. He sold his house to us, and we had to have police protection and all that stuff, but forget all that. I'm talking about Mr. McDonald being bold and brave. First time I ever saw a shotgun. Now later I saw shotguns because my grandfather had them. But Mr. McDonald had a shotgun at my next door neighbors. That's Mr. McDonald. Yep, I stood on his shoulder as a kid. He took us on his speedboat. He taught me how to swim. And the list goes on and on. He was a gardener extraordinaire. And my mother and he used to garden together. And they took a piece of the fence down and they had cherry tomatoes that they would plant. He'd plant some, she'd plant some. And then I kind of learned about gardening from Mr. McDonald. So, I'm praising Mr. McDonald, who's probably been in heaven for 50 years. Then I was thinking about Mr. Tarr. Mr. Tarr was math teacher at Southeastern High School. And he took me to museums. He took me to Greenfield Village, the historic museum. He took me to Detroit Institute of Arts 3 or 4 times. Mr. Tarr took me to my first antique shop and explained to me colonial, federal, Victorian, Edwardian furniture. And of course, it was too much. But Mr. Tarr explained all that. And I started keeping a journal. It was Mr. Tarr idea. Keep a journal in case you ever want to write an autobiography. Well, the journal's not very good, and there's very little there. But the other day I'm looking in it and I see when I was 17 years old that Mr. Tarr took 4 of us kids to 4 antique shops on a Saturday. And with his new bride, he got married at about 48 or 9 years old, and she was cool and he was cool. And I stood on his shoulders, and I think a lot of my cultural underpinnings came from spending 2 years every other Saturday going someplace with Mr. Tarr, who's taking these poor kids to see the cultural world. Mrs. Rose lived next door, and I think Mrs. Rose had a little money. And Mrs. Rose used to let me, when I was a kid, pick up stuff off her yard and then later cut her hedges and cut her grass. I don't think I was ever very good at it. I wasn't much interested in it. But I was interested in the dollar. And I didn't realize till years later that other people got, including grown people, got $1 or $1.50 for that work, and Mrs. Rose gave me $1, which is probably equal to $5 or $6 today for half hour's work. Mrs. Rose, I want to thank you. Now, I could go on and on and on. Mrs. Taylor, sociology, social work teacher in high school, helped me fill my application to get into the University of Michigan. I didn't know how. My mother didn't know how. We'd never gone, anyone in our family, to college. But Mrs. Taylor, she helped me get admitted to the University of Michigan. I ended up not going because they offered me 50% and we couldn't come up with the other 50%. Mrs. Taylor, thank you very much. I went to good enough school. So I end on this note, because I think this young man from the other day should realize he's standing on shoulders. I'm standing on 100 shoulders. I'm standing on John Conyers Sr.'s shoulders. in his grave for 35 years, I'm sure, talking to God. He's a fabulous human being. One of the founders of the UAW, Congressman John Conyers' father. And he taught me about government. He taught me about labor unions. He taught me about politics. And he helped me get an internship with his son when I was 19 years old. Standing on John Conyers Sr.'s shoulders. Almost all of us are standing on the shoulders, sometimes of giants, like John Conyers Sr., founder of the UAW, founder with 20 other people of the UAW, or Mrs. Rose, always an old lady with a little money to share. Enjoy this weekend.